Hello, here we are today on Hollingsworth Road at the home of Andy and Danielle Swisshelm. We want to thank them for allowing us to video today's program. My name's Bethine Struing. I'm one of Iola's daughters, and today also with us is Lisa Robinson. She's been the voice on some of these other videos, but we decided today to be on the video stream with Mom. This farm and house that is next door here is the last farm and home that Mom lived in with her parents before she got married and to our dad. So we wanted to use the backdrop here, and when we got here today we were not expecting this beautiful backdrop that we have, but we are very thankful and appreciative to Danielle and Andy to let us be here. This video is going to cover Mom's life from 1919 until 1937, when she's graduated from high school and getting ready to meet our dad. Please keep in mind that the year is 1929, so from the time she was 10 until 1940 was the Great Depression, and there were effects of that you're going to be able to understand as she describes her childhood here and the effects that it may have on her life. So we're going to start with,
our grandfather was Dwight Burr, Mom's father, and he was born in 1888. He had 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and he was their 5th child. So you had lots of aunts and uncles. Can you name the aunts and uncles?
Yes, Uncle Charlie Burr was the oldest, and then there was Aunt Femi Lewis. Her right name was Lou Femi Myrtle, and she said when she was growing up, and her younger brothers, if they got mad at her, they called her Mud Turtle. So that would upset her and make her get really mad. But then after her, let's see, was Uncle Fred, and then there was Uncle Horace, and Uncle Henry, and my dad, Dwight Burr, and Katie, who married Charlie Miley, and Aunt Mary Geringer.
Okay. So storytelling has always been a big part of Mom's life, going clear back to her parents and grandparents. So tell us some childhood stories about your dad, Dwight Burr, that you recall him telling.
Well, one of them was when he was about, now around 7, 8 years old, and Aunt Femi by that time was married and had a baby named Harold, and where they lived, there was, behind the barn, there was a stone quarry with a big hole in the ground, and Aunt Femi had Harold out in his baby buggy, and my dad was in charge of watching him. Well, all of a sudden, I guess Dad saw something else, and he let go of the baby buggy, and it started towards the quarry. Aunt Femi grabbed it, of course, and saved it from going in there. And my dad said she never scolded me or anything. She just hitched up the horse and buggy and took me home. And he said that hurt me worse than if she'd have scolded me, because he loved to stay there.
Tell us about him trying tobacco.
Well, when he was a kid, his dad, I guess, was out in the field. They were cutting with a binder, cutting the wheat, and my grandpa was a tobacco chewer, and he sent my dad to the house to get him a new bag of tobacco. So, being a little kid, he opened it, and he put some in his mouth, but he said it about made him sick. But later years, he chewed tobacco.
We remember that.
Yeah. Yeah.
With his can. What about a Christmas gift one year, or Christmas story?
He told us this too, that when he was little, they lived in the house on Burr Road. It had 2 stairways. It had a back stairway that came down into their living room, and so he said he thought he'd be real smart and slip down that stairway and catch Santa Claus. And he said the next morning all he had in his sock was a piece of coal and a corn cob. So they must have saw him.
They must have peeked too much. Okay, so the whole family was musical, we've been told. Music was a very big part of their lives, really without any schooling musically. So tell us about their family and their musical abilities.
Well, my grandpa played the violin, and Aunt Femi and Aunt Katie both were excellent piano players. My dad played a mandolin. Let's see, one of them played, I think that was Uncle Fred, had a banjo, and one of them had a ukulele. There's pictures back of them with their instruments. So they always, when we had a get together at Grandpa and Grandma Burr's, in the afternoon there was usually always a lot of music going on.
And singing?
And singing along with it.
Yeah, you said your grandmother had a pretty voice.
My Grandma Burr was a beautiful alto singer. She tried to play the piano, but that wasn't in her, but she did have a beautiful alto voice. And my dad was a beautiful tenor singer.
Tell us about his going to school. How long did he go to school, and where did he go to school?
Well, I guess they went to grade school right there on Sutton Road, and it was called Compton School. I'm sure that's where they all went. And then one year he went to Bowersville to high school, and that's the same year that my mom was there, and that's really how they met, was at school. And she said she helped him a lot with his homework.
So that leads us into how they met.
That was at school, was how they met.
Yeah, and so then that will...
But just one year, Dad was a farm boy, and he went back to the farm, and Mom did what most young girls did at that time. When mothers had new babies, they had to stay in bed for 10 days, and that's what these young girls would go into the homes and take care of the home till the mother was able to be up and help.
All right, well, speaking
So,
of
yeah,
your mom,
go
we're
ahead.
going to introduce Edith McCullough as your mom. She was born in 1987, and she was the firstborn of 5 children to William and Rebecca McCullough, but only 2 of her brothers lived to grow up and have families. Can you tell us about her siblings and their families?
Yes, Uncle Lonnie was her oldest brother, and he married Pauline Strong, and they had, they had what, 3 children: Violet, Mildred, Robert and Mildred McCullough, and that was Robert from the McCullough Funeral Home in Xenia.
Okay, and then she had another brother.
Uncle Ori, he married Lena. Oh, let's see, I forget.
It's okay.
I know it, but I can't recall her.
Yeah.
McMillan was her name, Lena
Okay.
McMillan. And they had, they had Vera and Earl and Mary Frances and Hazel and Marvin. And they lived in their older years in, well, what's Fairborn now. They lived in what was Osborne at that time.
Okay, like we talked about in the ancestry video, your mother was quite young when her father died, and so she was raised kind of by a single mom that had to work pretty hard. But Grandma did go to school, so Edith went to school.
She went to school at the one-room schoolhouse on Irvin Road.
Okay.
And went there 8 years, and then of course, as she said, she came into Bowersville that one year for high
What
school.
kind of a student was she?
She was an excellent student. I would put my mother against anybody, especially in math.
Yeah.
She could, I know one experience that these guys were figuring up with pencil and paper, building a building, and they was square rooting is what they were doing, and Mom heard them, and she gave them the answer just out of her head.
Without the pencil and paper.
And this one guy said, I should be ashamed of myself. He said, I'm a college graduate, and you got it in your head before I could even think about putting it down on paper.
Yeah. Well, so she talked about passing an exam.
Well, the 8th grade Boxwell is what they had, and if you got the 8th grade Boxwell, if you desired, you could teach school.
Yeah.
I know of one lady that did, Marjorie Franklin's mother, Alta Early. That's what all she had, and she taught school for a few years.
Okay, so she was able to go to the Bowersville school by
Yes.
living with
Her grandparents.
her grandparents in Bowersville.
They lived, well, about a couple miles or so out of Bowersville, and that would be too far for her to get there every day. So her grandparents lived in Bowersville, really just across the street from the school. So that one winter is when she stayed there with them and went to school.
So you were able to come up with one story about her dating Grandpa, and it was a double date.
Yeah, with Orvie, well, she was later years Orvie Johnson, but she was Orvie Charles at that time. And I'm not sure who Orvie was dating, but there was something special going on in Bowersville, and the girls had taken their coats, but it was still too warm for them to wear them. So this lady said, well, I'll just take your coats upstairs, and when you get ready, you come around and holler up the window, and I'll toss them out the window to you. Well, unbeknownst to all this, when her husband come to bed, he took off his pants and he laid them on the coats. Well, when she threw the coats out, she also threw his pants out. And the girls got a big kick out of that.
I'm sure that was a huge joke.
I can hear them now laughing about it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you already said that they both, kind of did their own thing for a while after the 1 year of high school. He was a farmer. She went and helped new moms. But they got married in 1908 in the winter.
February.
So describe how she told you about getting to where they were going to be married and what all happened there.
This was, of course, horse and buggy time. And Grandma lived on, it was, that's Jamestown, Gunnersville Road there. And just down the road from there. And, of course, they were in their horse and buggy. And when they crossed over Hussey Pike there at Gunnersville, she said there was kids living around there, and they saw them. And as they were on their way to Fort William, they threw snowballs at them. So we know there was snow on the ground at that time.
So they got married by a minister in Fort William?
In the parsonage.
Okay. All right. And then shortly after they were married, then they were able to build a house?
Yes.
And tell how that came about.
Well, since Mom's father had died early, and when the grandparents passed away and with their estate, I guess Mom got $500, and she was of age at that time, so she got her money. But she said Lonnie and Nori were not of age yet, and Mr. Gorham, that was a neighbor, took charge of their money until they were old enough to get it, and said he never charged them anything for what he did. But Mom had $500, and that was when they were married, and they went down to the east end of Burr Road and built a house for $500 at that time. I'm sure it was probably 4 rooms was probably what it had. And my brother Forrest then was born while they lived in that house.
Now, you said they lived there for just a short time and then moved it.
Sometime between 1908 and 1912, they moved the house down the road. And Mom said that was the easiest move she ever made. She said all she done was packed her good dishes. And I guess they put, like today, they put logs under them and had to pull them with their horses down the road. And the house then is on the west end of Burr Road, where Eddie Howell owns a house today, which is still standing.
Okay.
But there's been more rooms built onto it since then.
That was a very good description of a mobile home.
Yeah.
One of the first mobile homes. Moving your home. All right, so we'll now introduce our Uncle Forrest. He was Mom's older brother, and he was born December, right, Mom? 1908.
Yes.
And he was named Forrest Christopher after both great-grandfathers.
Yeah.
So
but Christopher Ellis, who was Grandma McCullough's father, had told Mom, if you give him my name, I will give him my gold watch. And he did. Forrest got the gold watch.
Okay. So go ahead and give us some memories that you have growing up with Uncle Forrest as an older brother.
Well, by that time we had moved to the glass place on Hargrave Road. And he graduated from high school while we were still living there in 1927.
But what did he study
But
in high school?
What did he study? Well, I guess he just took what...
Didn't you say manual training?
Well, yeah, they gave
something?
a manual training, which was like, I guess, what David taught, industrial arts later, but it was called manual training then. And I've got in my house a little stand that he made in manual training.
In high school.
In high school, yeah.
So he had what was one of his jobs on the farm about
Well, in the summer,
grandma's chickens.
yeah, in the summer, Mom had these chickens out in just little coops with boards under them for foundations, and then they always put a rock on top of them. And of course, it was out, I think, at the edge of there was a fence between that and the garden, and then there was a cornfield come right up there pretty close. Well, the crows was by that time would swap down and grab a chicken or a hawk even. And so Forrest was old enough, I guess, that they gave him, I don't know, whether it was a shotgun, I guess, and he'd hide in the corn so they didn't see him, but I think he shot a few of them that got rid of them.
And then milkweed, there's stories about.
Oh yeah, well, this would have been like in World War I, and they planted oats, a lot of oats back then. And in the spring, then there would be a lot of milkweeds grow up in them. And my dad they would take a hoe and go out to the field and hoe them down. Well, Forrest, I don't know, but then he's probably 10, 12 years old. And he'd complain, he was tired. And then Dad would say, well, just think one of them milkweeds is a German. Well, boy, he'd jump into them then and mow them down because he thought he knew what was going on with the war.
So he played basketball in high school,
Yeah,
was a good
played,
athlete.
He played basketball in high school. I never saw him play, though, but I know he did.
He did play.
Remember, this was Depression time, and we didn't go like they do today.
Yeah. And then, he furthered his career by building and working with his hands. But when he was younger, what did he build that you can recall?
He built a crystal radio that we could listen to of nights. It didn't work too well in the daytime, but nighttime, I think, remember we could get WLS in Chicago on Saturday nights because it was a lot of hoedown music. It was really interesting to listen to it. And that was something that he enjoyed doing.
And then when you listened to a certain radio program called that was kind of scary.
Well, that was a little later.
Yeah.
But that was a regular radio we had.
Okay.
And about 10:30 or 11 o'clock, there was this program come on and it would say, "This is the shadow." And Martha, of course, wasn't all that big then, and it would scare her to death.
And Uncle Forrest had a car, too.
Yeah, he bought it was a little one-seater, and he would come home after he'd gone to Dayton. He would come home every weekend, and he'd pay Martha and I a dime to clean his windshields, clean the bugs off, and clean his car up for him. That was big money to us.
We already talked about the chickens, and we'll talk more about chickens later. But so our Uncle Forrest goes on to work and goes to Dayton.
He went to Dayton
too, with some other boys.
There was Marion and Grace DeVoe that lived in Dayton, and this Stanley Jones was their nephew. And so it was my brother Forrest and a friend that graduated from Bowersville was named Merle Gary. And then there was Stanley Jones.
Brownlee, didn't you say?
And Brownlee and the Jones boy.
Yeah.
Edward
Brownlee and Stanley Jones.
Yeah.
And Stanley Jones would have been Grace and Marion's nephew.
Mm-hmm. So what did they do, though?
Well, they got jobs, I think, at Frigidaire.
Mm-hmm.
And Grace and Marion both worked. She worked in Reich's downtown, and I'm not sure where he worked. But they boarded with them, and she had in their refrigerator and a note left, and the first person home of an evening started supper. The boys, it was included, whoever was home first, she had instructions for them what to do to start supper.
So our Uncle Forrest, we know, worked at Frigidaire, then on to NCR, and then finally at Wright Pat Air Force Base. Yeah. And where he met our Aunt Thelma.
No, he met Thelma at NCR.
NCR, okay. And they got married, and then later moved in 1942 to Utah and then on to Spokane, Washington.
Yeah, and they were there for, well, during all the wartime, and they never was able to come back until war was over. And of course, he couldn't tell us at the time what he was doing for them, but later he told us that he was working on what they called the Norden bomb site. It was something to do with the war.
So yeah, we always knew he
Yeah,
had top clearance.
It was secretive.
For that time,
he
yes.
couldn't tell us.
Right, and our Aunt Thelma worked for IRS
When they came back.
And they, being from a big family, they never had children, so
No,
they were always
Thelma
together.
had 3 sisters. They were raised as orphans. Their mother and father passed away when they were very, very, very young, and they were all in a home somewhere in Richmond, Indiana. And as each one of them got out past 18, they had aunts and uncles in Dayton,
Right.
and they came to Dayton and got jobs, and those 4 girls all lived together.
Didn't they live through the flood or something?
Yes,
When
in
there's
the
a story about
1913 flood, they lived on East 3rd Street, and Thelma said that they took them out the upstairs window in a boat.
yeah, that's what I thought.
The flood was bad at that time.
So we remember our Uncle Forrest and Aunt Thelma always being around for family dinners, and always a good time whenever they were together with the family.
Well, he took
So-
a lot of pictures of us.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of the pictures at, early family dinners
Family
were
pictures,
because he
yeah.
had a camera.
And they loved
Yeah.
to travel. They took a lot of travel pictures too. So
Yeah, they used to go to Michigan a lot of times in the summer and fish, and then they would pack their fish in ice and bring them home.
All right, so then we'll move on to the next sibling born in the family. This is our Aunt Letha. She was Mom's older sister, born in 1912, so she was about 7 years older than Mom. So one of the best stories, and we had not heard this until just recent years, was when Aunt Letha was dating someone, not our Uncle Lawrence, I don't believe, but this was one of our favorite stories that Mom told us when we were doing some of our family projects about her dating. So tell us that story. This was a good
I
one.
don't remember who the guy was she was dating. This was a Sunday evening, and of course he was there, and they were in the front parlor room, had the door shut to the rest of the house, and Uncle Lonnie and Aunt Pauline and their kids would come about every Sunday evening and to go to church with us. But they'd always come early enough that they'd be out at the barn with Mom and Dad when they were milking. So that would be Martha and I, Mildred and Robert. We got this idea. We had all these kittens, cats and kittens hanging around. And so we'd catch a cat and open the door and throw it in the room where Letha was. She'd open the front door and throw it out. Martha was on the outside catching the cats and bringing them back. And we kept doing that till Martha stubbed her toe. And that was the end of that. But we had a lot of fun.
Aunt Letha was
I don't
mad
know that I don't know that she probably told Mom and Dad what we done, but we sure didn't tell on ourselves.
So Grandma sewed a lot, so she had needles and pens and things around. But what was an interesting story that happened with Aunt Letha?
I don't know that
needle.
exactly, but had to be a needle got on the floor somehow, and Letha stepped on it, and it was in her heel. And they ended up and had to take her to Xenia to, I suppose it was McClellan's Hospital. They had to x-ray it, and they had to get it out of there. And it cost them quite a bit of money for, hard depression times. And so after that, Mom was always pretty careful where her needles were, that none of us stepped on a needle.
So a lot of people had tuberculosis back in that time. That was quite an ordeal that Aunt Letha did contract the TB. So
when she was in like the 5th grade, she missed, I expect from probably February on the rest of that school year. And it was TB that she had. There was another girl by the name of Pauline Brown. The same thing happened to her. And they used to say they had played outside when it was too cold and they got bad colds.
Nobody knew how
but
it
that
was
was what
transmitted.
they said, that but Letha missed school, and I could remember then in the spring when the weather got nice hot sunshine, we had this cot, and Mom would move it out in the yard, and Letha would lay out there in that sunshine. Well, then we had this Victrola when you wind up, and so they bought some exercise records for her, and so Martha and I had the job of winding and keeping it going for her. But one of us would lay on the floor while the other would be changing the records or winding, and then
We all
we'd
did the
take turns.
exercises.
So we all was doing some exercises.
Yeah. So we know after Aunt Letha graduated high school, she went on to Miami Valley to become a nurse.
And when they
Tell us about that.
When they did her examinations, they said that her lungs showed that she had had TB, but it had healed. And while she was over there, it was be a 3-year course, I think. She had goiter surgery, and they took out her tonsils at one time, and she was just kind of sick. And so she actually quit in January when she would have graduated in May, that her health was just that bad.
And she rode, used to talk about her getting to Dayton.
Well, yeah, and when she was over there, she would ride home on Friday nights. There was a traction line that ran between Dayton and Xenia, and she would catch that. It was close there to Miami Valley Hospital, that she could get on that, and I think it cost a dime to ride, and then we'd pick her up in Xenia. But by that time, then she was dating Lawrence, and he would take her back of Sunday night, so she didn't have to ride it back on Sunday night.
Yep. So we know Uncle Lawrence, he was a neighborhood boy, and you kind of knew of Uncle Lawrence before he was with Aunt Letha, right?
Yeah.
You kind of knew about him prior to him starting to date her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So about their first date, that was the story you remembered.
Well, we were up in Bowersville at our Grandma McCullough's, and I don't think Martha was with us. It was just her and I had walked up and down inside the sidewalks, and we was just ready to go back up the hill to Grandma's house, and Lawrence pulled over in a car, and she went up to the car to talk to him, and that's when he asked her for a date, and that, I don't know, that Sunday night, I guess, is when they went on their first date.
Yeah. And then they got married, and you recall how their wedding happened.
Okay, they went to Covington, Kentucky, but the night before the wedding, Lawrence was there, and Martha and I shined his shoes for him. And of course, they got up early the next day. Of course, Martha and I were in school. So when we come home, Mom was in the kitchen, Dad was in the kitchen, had an apron on. He was helping her fixing the supper for us. And I know she rolled out some dough. Instead of cutting big biscuits, she cut it with a thimble and baked them, and then she had like cream chicken that she served over that. And that night at supper, afterwards, she said, Martha just kept eating and eating. She's afraid we'd run out. So then Lawrence's mother, they had us at their house, and whatever it was, something she had fixed, then Lawrence had a brother Kenneth, and Kenneth did the same thing. He was eating everything, and she thought she would run out.
So when people got married, being belled was quite the tradition back then. If anybody's watched The Waltons, you see there's an episode about chivalry or belling. So Uncle Lawrence and Aunt Letha had a belling
that same night.
Yeah. So how'd that go?
And all the Uncle Charlie Miley was usually the biggest duck in the puddle, as you might say. He enjoyed something like this, but Mom had told, because Forrest wasn't married to Thelma yet, but Thelma was there to go spend the night. And so Mom told us, she said, don't tell anybody which beds anybody's going to sleep in. So we didn't, but they fixed 2 beds. They fixed the one in the spare room and went upstairs and fixed another one. And of course, before we could go to bed, because they put flour in the bed and pins, straight pins. And my dad did, of course, before we go to bed, they had to be taken care of. And so he's the one who took them all out and shook them out off of the front porch. And he said the next morning when he went out, it looked like we'd had a snow. There was so much flour out there.
So Uncle Lawrence and Aunt Letha have 4 children. Go ahead and tell us about those.
Helen and Phyllis.
First cousins.
Helen and Phyllis and Dick and Raymond. Helen, they were born, see, Martha and I were still at home, and Mom went down to leave us when Phyllis was born. And back then, this is when we were having threshers with wheat, and it was July, and of course Mom had to go, and we were scared to death that Martha and I or somebody would have to come and help us to fix dinner for the threshers, but it so happened the threshing got done before Mom went down there.
So we've been blessed being close with those cousins through the years, and
Yeah, Helen
just
and Phyllis.
Helen and Dick are all the only ones
Left.
Yeah, we've lost Phyllis and Raymond. So, all right. I think we're ready to move on to the next
All right.
sibling.
Yeah. Well, the next section is going to be about you, and we're going to lump Aunt Martha in with you because that's just kind of that's just
we
what
grew
happened.
up together.
You were born in 1919, Aunt Martha in 1922. So first tell us where they lived where Grandma and Grandpa and y'all lived when you were born.
They lived on Sutton Road, and I've always called it the Falk place because that's who Dad sold it to when we moved away from there. I don't have any idea to know when they moved there or when we left there. Because
Right.
I wasn't old enough to remember, but
Sure. Well, tell us about when is your real birthday?
Which one?
Your real birthday.
Oh, well, Mom and Dad told me what they did the night before I was born. And she had raised her chickens out in these little coops. Well, when they got too big for the coops, so and this was October, then these chickens had all roosted up in the trees. And so she said it was a Monday night. And they went out after supper and caught those chickens and carried them to the chicken house. By that time, Forrest would have been about 11 years old, Lisa was 7, so I'm sure they were out there helping them.
Right.
And it was a rainy evening, she said, and they moved those chickens in the chicken house. And that day, she had cleaned her house, she had baked a cake, and she had dressed the chickens. And when Aunt Emma Burr came, she said, "Edith, it looked like you was expecting company."
She was nesting.
And that's what I think she had an inkling that I would be born.
So
And
then she obviously went into labor.
I don't know, earlier that evening, I guess, because I was born, my birth certificate says 1:01 a.m.
Okay.
And
So what date did it say?
it said, I always said it was October 14th, but when I got my birth certificate, it said October 13th, so I had to change everything. Had to change driver's license, Social Security, everywhere. Any place where I went, doctors or anywhere, I had to change all that.
Yeah. Even though you said that Grandma went to Dr. Ream, who had delivered you, and asked him to write out a
This was
new
later.
birth certificate for you.
This was later, and it definitely says October 14th.
Which
But my dad always would say, "You were almost born on the 13th." And Mom would say, "No, she wasn't. She was born after midnight." And I believe what my mom and
Yeah,
dad
maybe
said.
that's how it got wrong.
But
maybe
I
Grandpa
think-
gave it the wrong date.
Anyway, somehow Dr. Ream evidently sent it in with October 13th.
So that's why we celebrate both days.
Yeah.
By now, we just cover them both.
Aren't we
And-
up to about a month
and Dr.
celebration now?
And Dr. Ream, when he left our house, he went right across the road back to where Aunt Katie and them lived in the brick. And the Huffmans lived back there then, and he delivered a baby boy back there, Clarence Russell. And we went to school all these years, and Clarence Russell and I celebrated the same birthdays, October 14th.
Oh, well, that explains the picture we were showing you before we started, that it was Dwight with the horses at the Huffman.
Yeah.
That it was their neighbors.
Well, they had lived in there all their lives. So.
Yeah.
And that was the...
That explains
That's
that.
probably who Dad bought it from. I don't know that.
Right.
I guess you could go back to the deeds, early deeds, maybe, and find out.
Probably, yeah. So how did you get your name?
My Aunt Emma Burr, Uncle Fred's wife, was there. They lived up the road, neighbors, and she's the one that when she come said, "Edith, I think you were looking for company." And when I was born, and Saul was a little girl, And she said, Edith, if you don't have a name for this little girl, I would like for you to call her Iola May. And then she said, I'll have 2 nieces by the same name because her sister had a little girl by the name of Iola May Martin. I never saw her. She lived in Idaho, but I have a picture of her somewhere when she was about 6 or 7 years old with her dolls.
So when you asked Aunt Letha where they were when your mom was birthing you, what did she tell you?
I asked her one time, I said, where were you in Forest? She said, upstairs in bed. Said, we came down the next morning and said, they said, see your new baby sister? So they had no idea there was going to be a baby.
Pretty easy.
All right, so you were about three when Aunt Martha was born then. And there is a story about her birth as well, because she was really early.
Oh yeah, she was very much a preemie. I don't know that I ever heard him say exactly what she weighed, but Dad would always say she didn't weigh more than a cake of soap after a week's washing, and that would be pretty slim.
How did they handle her?
Well, and then she was jaundiced after that, and they thought they were going to lose her. And when she got her birth certificate, it just said baby girl Burr on her birth certificate. She had no name.
Yeah.
And so Mom and Dad had to go with her to verify she was the baby born that day.
Interesting.
Yeah. Was she named after anybody, Martha?
I don't know that. Estella, of course, we had an Aunt Stella, but this was Estella. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So almost all your childhood stories are you and her in it together.
Yeah.
You know. But the first story you've told about her was actually playing school.
Yeah, I started to school.
And taking her to school.
I started to school in 1925. And see, she was born in 22. So after I learned how to read, I would bring my book home of the night. And where we lived, there on the glass place, it had an open stairway that came down into the kitchen. And she would sit on about the 2nd or 3rd step, and I was on the floor, and I was her teacher. And I read stories to her, and
from your reader.
From my reader, and then I took her to school when I was in the 3rd grade. They used to let you bring your little brothers or sisters to school to visit, and I took her to school. So of course I tell Miss Bales, our teacher, I said Martha can read. Well, then of course they began wanting her to read, and she was kind of backward, and so finally Miss Bales gave her, I think, I don't know, dime or quarter or something, and Martha got up and read with my book and read every word, didn't know one word from another, but she with the pictures, and then she would turn the page when she's supposed to, and she would have been what, 3 1/2, 4.
Well, yeah, she wasn't in school yet.
Well, we always said Aunt Martha had a photographic memory.
Yeah.
So
I think that was
I
first
think
proof.
this was
That
a
was-
very
that was
early
it.
indication that she definitely was gifted.
Yeah, she sure did. All right, so then you girls were assigned chores.
Yeah, when we were growing up.
So what was yours, what was hers?
My chore was to, by the time I got big enough, was to take care of the chickens in the chicken house. And we had a hand-turned corn sheller, and I would get a bucket of corn and run it through there and take that to the chicken house and dump it, and then carry them some water and gather the eggs. And Martha's job then was to bring in the coal and the cobs. Mom used some cobs in the cook stove for it to start earlier, and that was Martha's job to do that. And one time, I don't know, the coal bucket tipped, and she had a black toe out of the deal. A lump of coal fell on her toe.
Well, and you had an incident with some eggs.
Well, that was at the glass place we lived, and that barn, that was a unique barn. It had a stairway to the hay mound. It wasn't a ladder, it was a stairway. And so, of course, Mom's chickens run loose everywhere, and so she told me to go to the hay mound, see if I could find any eggs. Well, I should have taken a bucket or a basket or something, but I just go up there with my, all little girls wore dresses then, with my dress tail, and I found eggs and put them in my dress, and I started the house. But before I got to the house, I broke a few of them, and some of them were rotten. So my smell wasn't very good.
All right, you both also had a job when it came to collecting feathers or
Oh, well,
Grandma had a job and you girls had jobs.
well,
so.
that was on the glass place that
Okay.
she raised geese, and in the I guess the spring was the older geese that she would pick the downy feathers, and we would chase all these geese into a box stall in the barn, shut the door on them. Mama had a little stool in there she's sitting on. She always bought her flour in 24-pound bags, and so she turned the top down a little bit on one of them, and that way it would stay open, and it was at the chair beside her. Well, our job was to catch a goose and give it to her, and that's what she would do, pick the feathers, stick their heads under her arm, and once in a while one of them would get her on the arm. She'd have some black and blue spots, and she'd drop the feathers down in the bag, and then we'd turn that one loose and catch another one until we were done.
So did she make pillows or
Feather beds.
feather
pillows.
beds?
We all
that's
had,
a lot of feathers.
we all slept on feather beds with straw ticks underneath them. Never owned mattresses back then. Well, there wasn't such stuff as that. We know them. All the cities might have had them, but
Right,
regular farm people didn't have anything like that.
right. So you also helped planting the gardens. So pumpkins, potatoes.
Well, that after the corn was up, 3 or 4 inches, then we would go to the cornfield, and Mom would plant these. They were cornfield beans, they called them, and they would vine up the stalk of corn, so they was easy to pick. Just go out there and pick your beans, and that's what she would hoe. She had the hoe. She would hoe the hole, and we would drop 3 beans in each hole, and then she would cover it and go on to the next one till we were done. Well, then we did pumpkins the same way, and Martha said one time she got tired of pumpkins, so she was throwing them away. I expect we had pumpkins come up in the field. It wasn't where they
Not
were
in the
supposed
rows.
to be. Wasn't supposed to be.
Right.
It always seems like Aunt Martha had stories about herself, but I don't know that Mom was always the mischievous
I don't know that I
one.
threw it any away, but she
Yeah.
did. That's what she
We
told
never
us.
heard too many mischievous stories about you. It was
No.
always Aunt Martha.
But you also helped your dad on the farm.
Oh, well, this was, if you're talking about the potato patch,
I'm talking about the potatoes, yeah.
he usually, besides the garden, had a potato patch. This was on the Oxley place on Hosey Pike. And I was riding the horse. We were plowing him. And I was riding the horse, and he had the plow, and I never could understand why he needed me on that horse, because he had the lines to the horse.
Right.
But I sat on this. But one day, out in this hot sun, and a neighbor, Jess Harry, came up and talked to him. Dad went over to the fence, and they probably talked for a half an hour, and he just sitting out there in the hot sun on that old hot horse.
Well, so these were work horses, you said. It was
Yeah.
never pleasure horses,
No.
never riding horses.
No, never.
But the same work horses would be hitched to the buggy, I suppose, in times
Yeah.
past. They
Oh,
would have been buggy horses.
Well, back when they depended on them, they
Yeah.
probably had special
Yeah.
horses that they kept for buggies, and rather than the farm horses.
Yeah. But your dad bought his first car before you and Aunt Martha were born, or you think around
Oh
the
yeah,
same time?
it would have been before that.
Before that. Well, tell us the story, though, about his
Well, this
first
is
car.
what he told us. Now, believe it or not, we'll say. He bought it in Xenia, and Horace Johnston, who lived at Gunnersville, wanted to go with him. And they go, now how they got to Xenia, I have no idea. Somebody must have dropped him off. But Horace wanted to drive the car home. And he lived there at Gunnersville, and Dad, this is the story they told, that when he got to Gunnersville, Horace just slowed the car down, jumped out, and Dad slid over and drove it home. And he said when he got home, he absolutely had no idea how to shut the car off. So he says he drove it around in the barn lot till it ran out of gasoline. Believe it or not.
That's a good story. That's
Yeah.
a good grandpa
That's what
story.
he would tell us that. So I guess that probably had to be, it could have been the Burr house, or the last place. I don't ever remember riding in a horse and buggy
Right.
as grown up.
Right. Well, but we know by 1929 through 1933 you were living on Hussey Pike in the Oxley place.
Yeah.
And you and Aunt Martha were school age by then.
Yeah, we were both in school.
Yeah, so Grandma in the meantime is still raising chickens, and she had a problem with the disease there in the dirt or something?
With the baby chicks, it was called the gaps. And she tried it out 1 year, and the babies were dying. And that's what they found out was wrong with them. So the next year, she hatched them. And then out behind the big barn, there was a smaller little barn, had a hay mow in it. And they cleaned that out, and she put her baby chickens up there with their fountains and their feed. But to get up there, it just had a hole, you pushed the board off the top of it. And the ladder actually was just boards up on the side of the wall. It wasn't a ladder. And my mom at that time was pretty heavy. But she would climb up there 2 or 3 times a day, probably when they were smaller, to take care of those chickens. That was very much of a hardship. Then as they got older, then they could put them out on the ground. But there's what they called the gaps. And I remember seeing her do this with some of them baby chickens. She would go out like the Timothy head where it would have little sprigs on it. She would use them and open their mouths and go down in that little throat. And the little gappy worms would come out on that. But it would kill those baby chickens. And so after they got up so big, then she could put them out on the ground.
With the other chickens. Yeah. Well, those chickens were a real source of revenue in some ways because she sold her eggs or traded
absolutely.
her eggs.
Everybody back then, farm ladies especially that had chickens, would save their basket of eggs, take them to the grocery, and they would pay you price for them. And sometimes the amount of eggs you had paid for your groceries.
Right.
And that was common everywhere back at that time.
Yeah.
I don't know what the store did with them. I guess it was people buying them, but there may have been somebody bigger place come and pick some of them up to take them to the city.
Yeah. In the meantime, she's not only raising chickens, but she's preserving, canning.
Oh yeah. My mom was a hard worker.
Baking bread every day.
She baked her own bread, and she baked at least 2 times a week, maybe sometimes 3, just depended. And she always made about 4 loaves at a time. And when we'd come home from school lots of days, that bread would just be coming out of the oven, and it smelled so good.
Oh my God.
And then for supper that night, instead of slicing the bread because it was still warm, we would just tear it and eat it, put butter on it, and eat it.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so not only did you have these chores and all this hard work to do, but there were some fun times that you and Aunt Martha had too. So tell us about what you did with your doll clothes with your animals.
Well, we always had a playhouse too. Every place we lived when we were small always had a playhouse with Mom's broken dishes and pieces, made mud pies. You've not lived if you never made mud pies, I guess. And that's what we would do with these playhouses and everything.
What about the doll clothes?
Oh, the doll. Then we had, 1 year she got us these little baby buggies for Christmas. And we had the baby kittens and we had doll clothes. And so we would get these baby kittens and some puppies when we had puppies and dress them up and try to keep them, they'd lay in the, I think we put a shoebox in there and push them around,
They were your babies.
Those kittens would sometimes jump away from me, but most of the time they'd lay there and they enjoyed it.
Now you had a mama dog that had an unusual name. I think she was named after?
There was a man in Bowersville with the name, I don't know what his right name was, but everybody called him Toot Evans. And so that's where we got the puppy from, or the female dog, and we called her Toodles.
Yeah, and then she met old Bob.
And they had the old Bob, they said they got him when he was about my age. They said they got him about the time I was born.
Yeah.
And they were both rat terriers. And so this one year we had puppies. and had given them all away down to one that we were going to keep. Well, there was a peddler by the name of Mr. Daniels that lived at South Solon that used to come around that once a week to the house. They'd have groceries, you know, that you could buy off of them, sugar, whatever you might need. And so he had taken one of the puppies for their kids. And so a couple of 3 weeks after that, he came back one day and he said, my kids are just crying and bawling their eyes out. He said the puppy got a hold of some poison and died. And so Dad said, take this one. And this was the one we were going to keep. And that's the one in that picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sitting on a stump holding him.
Yeah. So, you learned how to roller skate and had a fun time while Aunt Martha was having not such a fun time.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
That was the year before she started the school. And at Haynes's Hospital, they brought her up, and of course that was an all-day affair. And Mom had a first cousin that lived across the street there from the name of Early, and Zora Early. And so I went over there, and they had a daughter, Helen, who was about 3 years older than me, and she had roller skates. And so before the day was over, I had her roller skates on, skating on the streets in Jamestown. That was my first experience with roller skates.
And in the meantime, what was happening to Aunt Martha at Haynes Hospital?
And she was getting her tonsils out.
Okay, but roller skates entered in again. So you lived on Hussey Road. When you first moved there, you said it was gravel.
It was a gravel road, but the next year they blacktopped. The year before we moved there, they had blacktopped from Bowersville to that Beale Road, and that blacktop there was smooth as satin. I mean, it was just smooth. Then the next summer, from Beale Road to Gunnersville, and ours was rough. It was really rough. But LaVon Burr, our first cousin, we were up there one day, and LaVon had a pair of skates, and of course she was too old to wear them anymore, or to use them anymore, so she gave them to us. And so Martha and I each had a skate. That's the way we skated for a long time. We just each one put on one and we'd skate, and then we'd let each other, you know, put on both of them to skate.
Yeah. But what did you have to wear to skate?
Mom had made Letha, when she was in nurses training, some big-legged pajamas, and so Mom let us wear them out, and we roller skated in those.
Because you didn't have pants to wear.
No.
It was all dresses.
Little girls did not wear slacks at that time.
Yeah.
Everybody wore dresses.
Yeah. So, all right. So then you had a wonderful week of snow.
Well, that was on Hussey Road.
Yeah.
And there was school was out, no school all week. Well, down the road from us lived Henry and Mary Brown. Henry was a year older than me, and Mary was a year younger than me. And so they had a sled, a big sled, and a team of horses. So Henry gets this out, and he puts a chair up on the sled, and I can see him yet wrapped up with a robe, and he drove this team of horses. Well, we had one sled, and the Gerard boys had some sleds, which lived up the road from them. Lowell Woods lived back off the road. He had a sled, and Wanda Airy had a sled. And so all that week, Henry and Mary would come down with that, and we would just drive up and down Hussey with no traffic whatsoever. And then if we got cold, we'd go into somebody's house. They'd make hot cocoa for us, and then we'd go back out. We did that all week, and that was a lot of fun.
Well, that sounds like a really fun memory. So, well, speaking of hot cocoa, chocolate was a big part of when you could supper.
Chocolate pudding.
Chocolate pudding.
That was my favorite. If Mom, when I got up big enough to cook, if it was left to get supper, we had fried potatoes and chocolate pudding. That was my dishes that I picked.
Yeah, and what did Martha say about that?
Well, this is what she said. I think she's kidding though. She said she got tired of chocolate. She didn't like it as well as I did, I guess. And so she said, I put ground up horseradish in hers one time. She said it didn't taste bad. She said it tastes like coconut.
Chocolate pudding is still one of our favorites. We ask her to whip it up for us, and no recipe.
Well, she said Dad used to say, I can tell when you got a new box of cocoa by how chocolatey the pudding was. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's something we've all had our whole lives. I don't think we ever put horseradish in it, though.
No, I don't think we ever got tired of it, though.
No, that's true.
Yeah, yeah.
And Mom would make what she called float every once in a while. It was just an egg, and then it was whipped up with the meringue on the top. And guess what? When I'd eat it, I'd get the cocoa box and stir some chocolate
In hers.
So you made yours chocolate.
I made her chocolate.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, you've talked about having a lot of cousins, and you visited back and forth with some of those. And Mildred and Robert's parents moved over closer to New Jasper. So,
And they lived what is the golf course there now. And at that time, it was called the Gold Mine Farm. I don't know why, but it was called the Gold Mine Farm. And of course, that creek went through there. And there was a place back of the house, back in there, that Uncle Lonnie told us we couldn't go back there. He said it's too deep because somebody had taken sand out of it at one time. But we went down closer to the road, and when we were kids, it would come up about like this. But it was kind of a mud bottom. We said we mud crawled, but we had a lot of fun in there. And then one time with Mildred with the fish, she went earlier than Violet and I. And of course we didn't have bathing suits. We just had old dresses that we would wear. And by the time we got down there, Mildred was in the water, but she raised up when we come. And she was a little bit full-busted at that time, and I got a fish. And she did. She'd had a fish whipped out. And she got some creek water and put it in her shoe, put the fish in there, took it to the house, put it in a tub of water. It lived about 3 days. But that was fun. But we had a lot of fun in that creek. And I went down there every summer and stayed a week, and then Mildred would come back to our house and stay a week.
yeah.
But that was a lot of fun. Every night they would go somewhere into no TVs and radios really, and Uncle Lonnie would go into New Jasper to loaf. Well, we'd just get up to the supper table, the dishes just sat there, and we all went into New Jasper, different places. And Pauline would go visit, and of course Uncle Lonnie visited there on the bench outside the store.
Yeah.
And that was, and then I know one year when I was down there, they were putting up hay, and he had Mildred and I up in the hay mound tramping down the hay, and he gave us, I think, a dime or a quarter. Well, then every Saturday night they went into Xenia, and people did that then, and that's when you could pull in park, you know. And Aunt Pauline would always just sit in the car. And they said, you know, you'd watch people walking by. Well, before we could go home, then with our money, there was a store called The Velvet that sold velvet ice cream. And for, I think, whatever money we had, you could buy a cone, and it had about 3 or 4 dips on it.
Wow.
It was very good ice cream.
That was a big treat.
It was. And we would do that on Saturday nights.
Yeah, yeah.
We'd look forward to that.
Now, we found a picture of the McCullough family after a reunion. We've been over to the Ohio Soldiers' Home for a family reunion on a Sunday. But the photo said Indiana-Ohio state line.
Oh, well, let's see, that was part of the Burr family. And Uncle Earl and Uncle Charlie Miley. And I think Forrest was in on that at that time. Nobody ever been out of state. And so they decided, and what we did, got in our cars, drove to the Indiana-Ohio state line, got out, took pictures, turned around and came back. Just to say we'd been to Indiana.
It was documented because you had the picture. Aunt Martha actually had the picture in the scrapbook.
That was a big deal.
Yeah.
Nobody
Grandma and Grandpa were in it. I mean, it was adults as well as the kids in your family.
Nobody had ever been out of the state of Ohio.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, we talked a lot about your school experience in the very first video that we did, but I want to talk a little bit about stories with you and Aunt Martha together. So, for example, you both played basketball. But she started to ask to play earlier than you.
Well, I didn't really put up a fuss much about playing, but I had when I was in the 5th grade, I guess what they said, an attack of appendicitis. And Mom and Dad wasn't going to let me play because they were afraid that would aggravate that. Dr. Ream came every day that week. I missed a whole week of school. And I don't know, he got his little case and asked Mom for a glass of water and a spoon. And he shakes powder in there and stirs it up. That's the medicine, whatever it was. But he came every day that week that I missed school. So I didn't really say a whole lot then about it. But then when Martha was a freshman, Martha wanted to play. And I said, unless I can play. So Mom went to Dr. Ream. He said, nothing wrong with her, let her play ball. So I played my last 2 years, but Martha got to play 4 years. But I think the year Martha played was the last year that there was girls basketball for 10 years. They said it was too strenuous for girls, and nowhere in the state of Ohio was girls basketball.
Yeah, I don't know when they changed that and allowed girls sports back in.
It's 10 years, I think.
At least 10 years. Wow. Well, that would have started after during the war, maybe the war years.
I think I remember you saying Grandma made your uniforms even, right?
Well, yeah.
The mothers sewed their basketball uniforms.
We wanted new uniforms. Well, of course, school didn't have much money. And so Walter Linton was our coach. And so my mom went. I don't know what other mothers of the girls went and bought. It was gray satin. Our colors was red and gray. And it was gray satin. And and we went down to Walter Linton's mother's house, Pearl Linton's in Paintersville. And the mothers all came and they cut out the tops, and then the mothers sewed them. And that was the way we got the ones that I have on in that picture.
So Grandma had to make two, one for you and one for Aunt
Yeah,
Martha.
at that point she
And Grandma sewed all your clothes anyway,
absolutely,
right?
she never bought anything.
And never sewed with a pattern? Never?
She made her own patterns.
Made her own
she
patterns.
never owned a boughten pattern.
Made her own. Yeah, amazing.
That is pretty amazing. But she didn't come to your basketball games.
Nope. She never saw me play, or no, she never saw Martha play. But Dad went to all of them. Charlie and Harley Hollingsworth, and they would come pick Dad up. Just to the home games. I don't know that they went, when we went away.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well,
they were at all the home games.
In the fall before you graduated, so this would be 1936, there was a school trip. You said a class trip, maybe. Was it a specific class?
Yeah, our whole class, senior or junior class.
Oh, the whole class. The whole.
It was a whole class.
Okay.
I think it was Mr. Downing. Maybe another teacher went with us. And we went to Columbus, went early in the morning, and they took us to the Ohio State Penitentiary, and we got a tour of that, and they even let us sit in the electric chair. And,
What a field trip.
and then in the afternoon, we went to the Ohio State football game. None of us had ever seen a football game in our lives because Bowersville never had football at that time.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it was just a trip to go.
But it was in the stadium.
It was in that stadium, and I
Horseshoe
think I
Stadium.
figured that stadium was about 10 years old at that time from the dates that it was built
Yeah.
when we went.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so then in 1937 you graduate as the valedictorian. No, I'm sorry, salutatorian. And then Aunt Martha graduates in 1930 as the
40.
I'm sorry, 1940.
40.
As
As
the
the
valedictorian. So obviously Grandma Burr passed along some of those brains to both of you
I suppose so.
with that photographic memory of
Well,
Aunt Martha.
Letha also was valedictorian of her class.
Oh, I did. We should have said that. So I'm glad you got that in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we know Uncle Forrest was pretty bright because he was working on building crystal radios and all other kinds of things. So, yeah. All right, so after you graduated, you had a scholarship, but that
Cedarville.
couldn't materialize.
Cedarville College it was in. The Cedarville College was small, and it was just a commuter college. They had no place for anybody to stay. And And I didn't drive, so didn't have a car, couldn't drive, so I never used it.
So what'd you do instead?
Well, I worked in different homes. I went to Floyd and Nell Smith's, so she had a lady there that she was taking care of, an elderly lady. And this lady was getting bad. In fact, she died while I was there. But I kind of washed dishes, helped in the kitchen, run the sweeper, dusted.
What was your pay, as you remember?
$3 a week.
$3 a week.
But I stayed, slept in the bed upstairs, and was there all around. And then when Uncle Charlie Miley's father died, I went to Aunt Katie's and was there like a week with them. And that's what I got there.
Yeah. And if you weren't doing that, you were helping your dad?
In the fall, yeah, when they had stalk corn and they shucked stalk corn, and that's where I would go out to the field with them every day. Mom and I both. They give me the row next to the wagon. Mom took the next one, and then Dad took the next two over. So we were shucking 4 rows down the field.
Called a four-row picking team, huh?
Yeah, and the last day that we were, and that was over at the other place over here, and it was getting cold and snowy, and Mom would pack her lunch, because there was a crib over there. Dad could crib the corn, so we didn't have to go back here. And she'd pack our lunch, and so that one day when we got ready to eat, it was so cold that she had milk in some pint jars, and there was flakes of frost that was froze.
Oh my.
And so Dad said, "You women are done." That was it. We never went back.
That was the last day you had to be outside and pick. Wow.
But that would have been several weeks or several days.
Yeah. So Aunt Martha would have still been in school. Then she graduated. So what did she do once she graduated?
Then she went to Dayton and got a job at the NCR. See, that's where, at that time, Forrest and Thelma were both working there at that time. And she got a job there. She stayed with them in Dayton until they left for their war job. Mm-hmm. And then at that time, Jim and his dad were working in Oakwood, and they took her every day to the NCR, and then they'd pick her up when they were done.
Jane just told me this morning she thought she was going to have to go to Washington with Uncle Forrest and Aunt Thelma, because that's where they thought Uncle Charles was going to be stationed.
Oh, wow.
And he had mailed her a letter and said that, and then before the letter got there, he got a hold of her and said, "Disregard that letter, my orders have changed." So he wasn't going to be going there, but she may have gone there, had his orders when he was in the service, been changed. So,
Oh, what Thelma did when they were out west, but she went to a beauty school and learned how to do hair. She'd never done any of our hair afterwards.
I never heard that.
She did that out there. But we never had her do anything. But the time she came back, then she got a job, with Internal Revenue.
Yeah, that's interesting.
She gave that up, but that's what she done.
Yeah. Well, so in summary, Mom, your childhood from when you were 10 was defined by the Great Depression. It started with the 1929 stock market crash and reverberated through all the rural communities, including this area of Ohio, and it didn't ease until 1940. So you've often stated that you didn't go hungry, you never had to stand in a soup kitchen line, and there are thought to be some actions that helped during those times, kind of in categories, and you've already described a lot of these things that you lived through. For example, increasing community support. So you've described threshing rings, and that included big dinners for everybody. You described, well, you didn't tell this story, but it's a great one. Your mom made, we talked about her baking every 3 times a week or whatever, but she had a starter?
Yeah, that's, I don't know, 13 years, I think. She said that she was able to save that starter, and she loaned it to a neighbor lady, because that was when Letha, run off. Mom had said, "We're going to go to Mrs. Kelso's after we get the dishes done." The next thing you know, Letha was gone, and Mrs. Kelso said when she said, "I come after the starty." And she ran off one time also, went to Grandma Burr's house, and by the time Mom missed her and got there, Grandma had her in bed asleep, so Mom wouldn't paddle her.
Oh. So another thing that lots of folks in the community we've already discussed was bartering with, like, your mom, you know, selling her eggs for groceries and
Cream.
and selling her cream. But did she separate the cream, or was that ever your job to separate cream, or is that just the adults did that? Or it was mechanically separated in the store, you said?
Well, see, they had a separator, I think, that you put the seed. You just put in, you crank it, and the milk goes out one, the cream went out another. But the one that also was a water separator, they called it. It was always blue, stood on 4 legs, had a spout at the bottom, and you would put your milk in, and then you would put as much water as you had milk, and then you would let it set. And this was outside. We had it in the shade, and then the cream would come up. Well, then you set a bucket under and run that watery milk off, and then you stop it. Then you get the cream separate. That was how it.
Yeah. So that was
one way. That was a water separator, they called it. But then there was the one that you turned the handle.
Yeah.
And it had spouts, and milk would come out one, cream the other.
Right. Right. So home production, growing your own vegetables, growing your own canning and preserving. I mean, Grandma did pickles. She did sauerkraut.
She canned every year, canned a lot.
And butchered. I mean, you had
always
hogs
butchered.
all the
Had her
time.
own meat and had her own eggs. Had her own. That's why I said during Depression we never were hungry.
Yeah.
We never were hungry. We
Yeah.
always had Mom had canned, but I know in Dayton and places where there were factories and people got laid off, and there was a lot of people suffered during that time.
Well, you said actually Uncle Forrest lost his job one year and came home.
Well, yeah, they laid off at the Frigidaire. They laid him off.
And so
he
he
was
was a
home one
volunteer.
winter.
You said he was a volunteer fire department.
Yeah,
or
he went up
fireman that year.
He went up to Bowersville and spent the time there with KB Bowermaster. That's where they kept the fire engine. And yeah, if he was there and they got a call, he went out with them.
Yeah, yeah. So then there were some government programs, and this is what I looked up. It was called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And you knew that your dad had participated in that to some degree.
Maybe not as much as it was Jim and I.
Oh, okay. All right. So
that was a little later
during the war.
Yeah, it
okay.
wasn't, yeah.
But the government was helping subsidize to
not to plant.
Not to plant so much, not to raise so many.
They paid you.
Right. Right. Well, that was part of FDR's New Deal, you know. So that was after Hoover was gone, and it was FDR now trying to get everybody out of the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
People moved to the urban areas. So we've got that example of like Forrest and Martha both leaving to work to go to Dayton.
Yeah.
And then the last thing that folks did was church and community activities, which we plan to explore more in our next and last 5th video. But before we jump to that, we want to talk briefly about World War II, even though it's a little bit out of the chronological order. We'll get back to you meeting Dad in the next video. But when the war broke out, your mother started working at Right Path.
Yeah, her and Vern Brakeville there in Bowersville. And I mean, they had some age on them.
Right.
But they went over and got jobs of welding is what they did. And Bob Ferguson lived there in Bowersville, and he took them over there every day. And I never thought my mom would ever do anything like that, but Dad took over. He was a good cook. He took over, taking care of the house. He'd have supper ready when she'd come home every night.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea how much she got paid?
No, I don't know.
But she kept her money.
But the money that she made there is what they bought that property that laid behind them from Fanny Bowermaster's estate when they sold at the courthouse, and Mom and Dad bought it with that money. That's what the money that she made over there.
Okay. So we already talked about the effect of the war on Uncle Forrest. He had to move from Dayton out to the West Coast to work on the Norden bomb site. That was a big secret. And then they eventually moved back to Ohio.
But he couldn't tell us that till after the war was over. We didn't know what he was doing.
The effect with Aunt Martha was that she and Uncle Charles were married, but he was drafted by the Navy, so she was alone for however many years, was really close to you and your early family because of that. And then once he was back from the war, they started their family. So describe Aunt Martha's having her family.
Well, her first baby that she had, little Cheryl Ann, she lost her about, I don't know, maybe 6 months, something like that. They fixed her, had a little casket for her, and Susie, Grandma Hollingsworth, made her a little dress. She was perfectly formed, had little fingernails, had the most beautiful black hair. That little doll that I had there that one time, that's about the size she was. And they had her up at Powers' funeral home there, and we had a little service, and then they took her to the cemetery and had another little graveside service. But see, Martha then was still in the hospital, so she was not involved in any of that. But she was born in Haynes Hospital, and Martha said through the night, they kept her there, and she said, I could hear her sound like she was sucking on her little fingers. And she was alive yet the next morning, and so Charles went with Dr. Linton, and they took her to Miami Valley Hospital, and I don't know, she lived several more hours. But she passed. She was just, I guess, just too young to make it. Little Cheryl Ann.
Yeah. So she's buried out at the Bowersville Cemetery. Okay.
And then within the next year, then she had Joe, and then she had Jane Ellen.
Right. And she was what I would have called your best friend.
Yeah, we grew up together. We slept, as we said, we slept together, we fought together, and we did everything together at home.
Yeah. Well, that was great because that allowed us to stay really close to Jane and Joe, and we had some good times. That would be a whole nother video.
Yeah, she used to take She used to take you kids all a ride on Sunday afternoon.
Oh yeah. And over the years you've said, I don't know how many times, oh, if Martha was alive, wouldn't she love to know this? Or you would say, well, Martha would have known this, you know.
A lot of knowledge left this world when Martha passed away.
Yeah, that's for sure.
She had a good mind, clear mind.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, we have the Creamer tears, or the Burr tears, I don't know, talking about Aunt Martha, because she has shared with us that Mom was with her when she passed. So.
Yeah, I was. I just had walked in the room, and I knew I'd been in there earlier. Jane Ellen and I'd been in there earlier and went home, and I was back before Jane Ellen got there, and but that morning when we were in there, I said, Martha, if you hear me, squeeze my hand. I got her 2 real tight squeezes, but I didn't pick up her hand when I went back in. But I soon realized she wasn't breathing, and I went out the door in the hall. She wasn't very far from down in there from the front, and I didn't see anybody, so I walked back in, and then I thought, well, I'll go outside again, and a little girl nurse was coming down the hall, and I said, I don't think Martha's breathing. And so the girl up at the desk evidently heard me, and so she came down there right away, and she said, no, she's not breathing.
Yeah. So we were glad you were there.
And I was there, and Jane Ellen had come in just shortly after that, I think, but Ann and Connie had come in, was going to come to visit her. And so we stayed. Dr. Sherrod came in. I showed Dr. Sherrod her finger where she had smashed it.
Oh yeah, well I think we told that story in another video, didn't we?
But I showed him that, and then I stayed with Jane until the funeral home at Savannah come and picked her up, and then I helped Jane take her possessions out once she'd had to the car, and that was it.
good end to a
And that was
chapter in your
that
life.
was the third person that I'd seen pass away. Well, no, my dad was the first, then my mom, and then Jim, and then Martha.
So as we finish wrapping up this episode, this covered a lot of time, a lot of years. When we were planning this, we discovered there were 2 houses still standing that Mom had lived in as a child, this farm and another one over on Hussey. So this was a pretty backdrop for us to be able to do our video here today. Andy and Danielle
I lived here
Swisshelm
5 years.
lived here 5 years. So when she lived here, we did ask her any memories, specific memories of living here through those years. And Mom, if you want to share anything else, you talked about how Grandpa, the farming
there was a
part,
fence.
Yeah.
Well, first, when we first moved here, there was a hedge all the way to the end of that road. And that year, that very year, then, of course, my dad had horses, and Charlie and Harley would come down, and Dad, they used his horses to pull all that hedge and would burn it, and then they put a fence in. And then, then there was a fence along here, and Dad had irises planted all along here.
Sense.
And he loved his flowers. He had
Love his
flowers
yeah.
everywhere.
And you talked to us about what they called privileges
Yeah,
when people
the
farm.
Yeah, the rent.
Explain that,
The Hollingsworths got half of the crops,
because they were the owners of the property.
and just half of the crops, and then you paid what they called a privilege of $150 a year. But that year, that took care of it. Dad didn't have to pay $150 to them, because they used his horses, and my dad worked with them. And, but that was a very, very fair rental. And there was 100 acres here, and then across over where the log cabin was, there was 50 acres over there that went with it. You farmed, so we farmed 150 acres here.
50 acres here. Okay.
And you can make a good living on 150 acres. We had cows. Mom had her chickens, hogs, sheep. We had lambs.
All right, well, I think this was all we have planned for this video. Our next and our last one that we are planning to do in this series, we'll talk about her church and community in Bowersville, and we will be doing that episode at the Bowersville Annex. So that one will be coming up soon. So
And she'll go from being Iola Burr to Iola Creamer.
right. So
Thank you.
That's all for today. Thank you.